Okay, so welcome to chapter 19. In this chapter, we're going to talk about conventional energy. What are the energy sources that we use to fuel the human civilization at this point? Take a quick look at the history of energy production, but then how do we actually make energy for our society? Think about it, we use energy constantly, 24/7. We're using some form of energy to sustain human life in the manner that we are sustaining it in today's society. So when we look at the history of energy production, probably the earliest energy production outside of human-driven energy production or animal energy production, the earliest forms of energy production were wood, firewood, burning wood for heat, for cooking, for whatever processes in the very early parts of human civilization. Then, as firewood became, I wouldn't say less abundant, but just not as efficient, people started to move over towards coal, discovering that there's energy in coal. I mean, this is all stored energy that's being released through combustion to use that stored energy for potential energy or kinetic energy or the energy of work. So then we shifted to coal. We had the Industrial Revolution, and coal became the major source of energy for most people. People were still using firewood, but we saw this shift and kind of this movement towards coal. Coal was a dominant form of energy for centuries. Then we started moving over towards oil. So coal has been, to a large extent, replaced by oil. Oil is the current energy source that drives the majority of human civilization. And we still have people using firewood, especially in developing countries. We still have some aspects of society that are being supported by the energy from coal, but we've kind of traded coal in, for the most part, traded in for oil, or oil forms of oil. And we'll talk about that later on in the lecture. Oil comes in a variety of different forms or types, and we can use those for different production of energy. So the question marks leave the question out there to say, what is the new future of energy? What source do we look to tap for the future of human civilization? Because we can't rely on firewood. It's not renewable with the size of the human population, and it has negative consequences, pollutants, etc. Same issue with coal. It's not renewable. A lot of pollution, a lot of environmental issues. And the same problem with oil. It's not renewable. It's not environmentally friendly. What do we move to? Ideally, we want to find something that's renewable, environmentally friendly. That's the drive for the new source of energy. And it's not a matter of completely replacing other energy forms, but decreasing our reliance on them. So nobody's saying, hey, let's come up with a new renewable energy source and 100% eliminate oil and coal. It's, can we reduce the amount of oil and coal and increase the amount of these other energies, the renewable ones, to offset some of the coal, the oil, and even the firewood as a form of energy. So we'll talk about different forms of energy in this unit, in this chapter, and what we do with them and their pros, but then also the environmental cons or consequences of those energy sources in this chapter. As we get into our following chapters, we're going to talk about alternative energy sources, renewable energies, sustainable energies. So we're going to fill in those question marks as we get into further chapters. So, all right, so to talk about energy, we got to figure out, how do we measure it? How do we measure energy? Well, let's look at some basic terminology here. Work. Work is the application of force over distance. So you have force over distance or action or activity, etc. And when we measure work, we use a unit called joules. So that's our little unit here. Let me get a highlighter on that one. So we're measuring work in joules in order to have a unit to reference. Oh, that's terrible. Let me get that out of there. All right, so when you hear the term joules, that's in regards to Let me just underline it and put in bold there. There we go. That's in reference to how we're measuring work. Now, energy is just the capacity or ability to do work. Power becomes the rate at which work is done. So when you're applying this force over distance, how fast, how powerful, how quickly are you doing that application of force over distance? And then we'll also use this term called a watt. A watt is 1 joule of work per second, or 1 joule of energy that is needed per second. So the light bulbs on the bottom, use those for an example. You go, oh, do I have a 60 watt bulb, a 150 watt bulb, a 80 watt, or 200, etc. Light bulbs come in different wattages. And that's telling us how much energy, how many joules of energy or joules you need per second to produce light. So if you have a 100 watt bulb versus a 60 watt bulb, you notice there's a different amount of energy consumption. Your electric bill is higher with the 100 watt bulb because you draw more energy to light it up. But on the return, you have a 100 watt bulb, you tend to have a brighter light. So part of energy conservation is figuring out how can I get 100 watts of light but not require 100 joules of energy to produce it. That's where we get into energy efficiency. All right. So when we look at the typical home, I want you guys to think about your houses, what you use, just the different things that are being powered primarily by electricity. What's being powered in your house? Think about your energy usage. How much energy do you use? And this is across the year, averages. Okay, we're all going to be different, but just general averages. That on average, we use 100 kilowatts of energy in the course of a year just for our computers. So the laptop I'm using right now to record the lectures, the computers you have at home when you're working on schoolwork, things like that, 100 kilowatts a year. Your television uses 125, etc. So you look at that 100 watt light bulb, 250 kilowatts. So we actually use twice as much energy to power our light bulbs in the course of a year as we do our television. But think about how often is that light bulb on versus your television being on. So it becomes a matter of usage as well. You know, the dishwasher, 600 kilowatts a year. And maybe we run the dishwasher once every 3, 4, 5 days, depending on the household. So those are things we want to think about when we start the conversation about energy conservation. What can I use or what can I do to reduce my energy consumption with these products that use energy? So how do I do that? Because big picture, it's good environmentally. It's good environmental practice. Better picture for us personally, it saves you money. Decrease your energy usage, your electrical bill goes down, your gas bill goes down, all of your bills go down, you save money by decreasing energy consumption. So again, it's a win-win, environmental win, financial win. The goal is to get more people to become energy aware and more energy conscious. So let's take a look at the global energy situation, because all humans are using energy in some form and fashion. By and large, fossil fuels supply about 80% of the world's commercial energy. This is global. These numbers here, these percentages, are constantly fluctuating and moving as one thing becomes more accessible than others, as countries move in certain directions with how they're producing power for their country. But roughly 35% of energy production comes from oil, about 25% from natural gas, about 20% from coal. Only about 10% of our energy, global energy production, is from renewables, and about 8% nuclear. So this is global. We break it down to countries, and you start seeing differences. Some countries have a much higher renewable energy percentage than oil or natural gas or coal or nuclear. And a lot of that is the economics of the country, the availability of different energy sources. If you don't have coal in your country, that means you have to import it. Do you want to be reliant on imports, or do you find alternatives to those imports? So those are factors that drive which form of energy or forms of energy countries primarily use. Now, a challenge here, and let's take a look at some big numbers here. This is 2017 U.S. energy consumption by what they call in-use sectors. So roughly 32% of the energy consumption in the U.S. in 2017 went to industrial processes. Okay, and we'll get into some of that as we talk about energy. 29% went to transportation, cars, trucks, boats, planes, trains, buses, movement of products. About 20% went to residential consumption, so our own personal homes fall under residential there. And then about 18% of energy consumption was done on the commercial market. So businesses, stores, restaurants, etc., commercial energy consumption. All right, so we want to think about that when we get into a conversation about energy sources. Industry is driving a lot of this because they consume the largest amount. Residential consumers could say, no, we want to shift this direction, but if industry and transportation want to go in a different direction, the market's going to move in that direction. Investment, resources, funding for research, it goes where there's the greatest usage. And that's, again, industrial transportation issues. Those two combined, you're looking at 61% of energy consumption, roughly, in those two areas. Now, each of us, on average, consumes about 60 barrels of oil per year with our energy consumption. 60 barrels. That's a barrel a week, a little over a barrel a week average. You take an average person from a less developed country, LDC, your underdeveloped nations, they use about 1 barrel of oil a year worth of energy consumption. So we, on average, use more energy every week than somebody in a developing country will in the entire year. So huge disparity, unbelievably massive disparity between developed countries and developing countries. Okay, so again, here's 60 for us, 1 for them. So what we use this week alone is more than what somebody in most African nations, Central American nations, Mexico, South America, etc., will use across a year. Now, generally, the income level and standard of living are tied to energy consumption. So if you have more energy, generally, this isn't always the case, but generally, your income goes up and your standard of living goes up. They kind of go hand in hand. As I get more income, I can afford more energy. More energy means I can do more things. I can improve standard of living. I can improve my economy, etc. So those things all kind of work together hand in hand when we look at energy consumption. So this is a concern when we look at developing countries. Make a different color here. Developing countries like China and India, and they are on that demographic transition. They are trying to improve the standard of living for their citizens, and they're trying to match or reach equal standard as the U.S. Those two countries combined, you're looking at almost 3 billion people. Think about how much global energy we'll need when they move to a same level of a developed nation that we have in the U.S. I want that to sink in. That's a huge concern when it comes to energy consumption. What form are we going to be able to find? What form of energy are we going to be able to find to support 3 billion people who want to consume the same amount of energy per year as each of us? We don't have 60 barrels of oil for 3 billion people. Think about the US, 330 million, about 1/10 of the size of India and China combined. That means we got to come up with new sources of energy to support the human population. So, all right, so we'll talk about sources of energy in our next lecture and take a look at all the different varieties and sources that we're using and the pros and the cons of those sources of energy.